Something remarkable is happening in our own backyard, and it's changing the balance of power in ways most Americans haven't yet realized. After decades of strategic withdrawal, the United States military is quietly reopening critical bases across the Caribbean, a move that signals a profound shift in how Washington views threats to the Western Hemisphere. This isn't simply about military infrastructure or routine exercises. What we're witnessing is a direct response to something far more consequential: the growing influence of external powers in a region. America has long considered its sphere of influence. China's expanding commercial ports, Russia's renewed military cooperation with Venezuela and Cuba, and the steady erosion of US diplomatic leverage throughout Latin America have forced Pentagon planners to reconsider long-dormant facilities. These bases, from the Bahamas to Trinidad, once served as frontline positions during the Cold War. Their reactivation tells us that Washington believes we're entering a new era of great power competition, one where geography, access, and presence matter more than ever. The question isn't whether this shift is happening, it's what it means for regional stability, American security, and the broader struggle for influence in a rapidly changing world order. To understand why this matters so profoundly, we need to step back and consider what the Caribbean has meant to American security throughout history. This isn't just any region. The Caribbean Sea and its surrounding territories form what military strategists have long called America's third border, a maritime frontier as important to US security as the borders with Mexico and Canada. Every major shipping lane connecting the eastern United States to the Panama Canal passes through these waters. The majority of American energy imports, even today, transit through the Caribbean. During the Second World War, German U-boats hunted American merchant vessels in these very waters, sinking hundreds of ships and nearly severing the supply lines that kept Britain in the fight. The lesson learned then was unmistakable. Whoever controls the Caribbean controls access to the American homeland. This geographical reality has shaped US policy for more than a century, from the Spanish-American War through the Cold War and beyond. But here's what's particularly fascinating about the current moment. For roughly 30 years, from the end of the Cold War until quite recently, Washington operated under the assumption that the Caribbean was essentially a solved problem. The Soviet Union had collapsed, Cuba was isolated and weakened, and no rival power seemed remotely interested in challenging American dominance in the region. The threat environment had shifted toward terrorism, drug trafficking, and humanitarian crises rather than conventional military competition. Consequently, many of the bases that had once bristled with activity were either closed entirely or reduced to skeleton operations. The logic seemed sound at the time. Why maintain expensive military infrastructure in a region where no peer competitor existed? Why not redirect those resources toward the Middle East, where America was fighting actual wars, or toward the Pacific, where China's rise was becoming increasingly apparent? For defense planners operating in the mindset of the 1990s and early 2000s, the Caribbean simply wasn't a priority. It was stable, it was secure, and it could be managed with a minimal footprint. That calculation has now been fundamentally challenged, and the reasons are multiple and interconnected. The first and perhaps most significant factor is China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has extended deep into Latin America and the Caribbean over the past decade. Now, when we talk about Chinese involvement in the region, it's important to be precise about what we mean. This isn't a traditional military expansion in the sense of Chinese troops establishing bases or deploying naval vessels permanently. Instead, what China has done is far more subtle and in many ways more effective. Through massive infrastructure investments, port construction projects, and development loans, Beijing has gained significant economic leverage over numerous Caribbean and Latin American nations. Countries that were once firmly within the American economic orbit now find themselves increasingly dependent on Chinese capital. When a nation like Jamaica owes substantial debts to Chinese state-owned enterprises, when Trinidad's port facilities are managed by Chinese companies, when the Bahamas has received billions in Chinese investment for tourism and infrastructure, the political calculus changes. These countries become less willing to align automatically with Washington on issues that matter to Beijing. They become more cautious about hosting American military activities or supporting US positions in international forums. The correlation between economic dependence and political alignment is well established in international relations, and China has studied this playbook carefully. Then there's the Russian dimension, which has taken on renewed urgency in the wake of the conflict in Ukraine. Moscow has been working methodically to rebuild relationships throughout Latin America and the Caribbean that had atrophied after the Soviet collapse. Venezuela, under both Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro, has welcomed Russian military advisors, purchased Russian weapons systems, and hosted Russian strategic bombers and naval vessels for exercises. Cuba, despite its economic difficulties, has maintained its old alliance with Moscow and has reportedly allowed Russian intelligence facilities to continue operating on the island. Nicaragua, under Daniel Ortega, has similarly moved back into Russia's embrace. What we're seeing is the reconstruction of a network of relationships that gives Russia staging points and diplomatic support in America's immediate neighborhood. For Washington, this is more than symbolically troubling. It represents a genuine strategic challenge. Russian intelligence collection from Cuban soil provides Moscow with insights into American military and political activities. Russian naval and air exercises in the Caribbean force the US military to dedicate resources to monitoring and shadowing these operations. Perhaps most concerning from a Pentagon perspective, the presence of Russian military assets in the region complicates American freedom of action and creates scenarios that were unthinkable a generation ago. What makes this situation particularly complex is that it's occurring against the backdrop of America's own diplomatic struggles in the region. Let's be frank about this. US policy toward Latin America and the Caribbean has been inconsistent and often neglectful in recent decades. Administrations of both parties have tended to focus on the region only when crises emerge, coups, migration surges, drug violence, and then shift attention elsewhere once the immediate problem recedes. There hasn't been a sustained, coherent strategy for economic partnership, development assistance, or diplomatic engagement that could compete with what China is offering. When Caribbean nations look at their options, they see China arriving with billions in infrastructure investment, asking for little in return except economic access and diplomatic support on issues most of these countries don't care deeply about anyway. Meanwhile, American aid often comes with conditions related to governance, human rights, and economic reform that, however well-intentioned, can feel paternalistic to recipient governments. The result has been a steady erosion of American soft power throughout the region. Countries that were once reliably pro-American in international affairs now frequently abstain on votes that matter to Washington or actively support positions aligned with Beijing or Moscow. This is the environment that has prompted the Pentagon's reassessment of its Caribbean posture. The bases now being reopened or significantly expanded represent an acknowledgement that the strategic assumptions of the post-Cold War era no longer hold. These facilities serve multiple functions, and understanding this multifunctionality helps explain why they're considered so valuable. First and most obviously, they provide forward presence. Having American military personnel operating from bases throughout the Caribbean sends a signal about commitment and capability. It demonstrates to both allies and competitors that the United States remains engaged in the region and possesses the infrastructure to respond rapidly to developing situations. Second, these bases serve as logistics and staging hubs. In any scenario requiring military operations in the region, whether humanitarian relief after a hurricane, counter-narcotics operations, or more serious contingencies, having established facilities with functioning runways, port facilities, and communications infrastructure dramatically enhances operational effectiveness. During the 2010 Haiti earthquake, for example, the ability to flow aid and personnel through established bases in the region proved absolutely critical. Third, these installations support intelligence collection and surveillance. The Caribbean serves as a transit route not just for legitimate commerce, but for drug trafficking, human smuggling, and potentially more concerning activities. Maintaining radar stations, signals intelligence facilities, and surveillance aircraft in the region provides American intelligence agencies with visibility into these activities. The specific locations being prioritized tell us something about Pentagon planning. Facilities in the Bahamas, for instance, provide coverage of the approaches to Florida and the eastern seaboard, while also monitoring the waters around Cuba. Bases in the Eastern Caribbean, places like Antigua or Trinidad, offer positions closer to Venezuela and oversight of the southern shipping lanes. Aruba and Curaçao, despite being Dutch territories, have hosted American counter-drug operations for years, and those relationships are now being deepened with additional US military presence. What's particularly interesting is that much of this expansion is being framed publicly around counter-narcotics and disaster response rather than great power competition. This isn't entirely disingenuous. These missions are genuine and important, but it does provide political cover both for Washington and for host governments that might be nervous about appearing too aligned with the United States in ways that could complicate their relationships with China or other partners. There are legitimate questions about whether this strategy will prove effective. Military presence alone doesn't solve the underlying issues driving regional countries toward China. If the United States wants to compete successfully for influence in the Caribbean and Latin America, it will need more than bases. It will need a comprehensive approach that includes economic investment, development assistance, and consistent diplomatic engagement. There's a risk that an approach too heavily weighted toward military presence could actually backfire, reinforcing perceptions of American heavy-handedness and pushing countries further into China's embrace. Some regional leaders have already expressed discomfort with what they see as a remilitarization of US policy toward the hemisphere. They remember the Cold War era when American security concerns often overrode considerations of sovereignty and self-determination for Latin American and Caribbean nations. There's understandable sensitivity about returning to that dynamic. At the same time, we shouldn't dismiss the importance of what's happening. The reopening of these bases reflects a serious and considered judgment by American defense planners that the strategic environment has changed in ways that require adaptation. The United States is reasserting itself in a region it had taken for granted, recognizing perhaps belatedly that global competition doesn't respect assumptions about permanent spheres of influence. For the countries of the Caribbean themselves, this creates both opportunities and challenges. Increased American engagement could mean more resources, more attention, and more leverage in negotiations with Washington, but it also risks drawing these nations more deeply into great power competition at a time when many of them would prefer to maintain flexibility in their international relationships. The small island states of the Caribbean have limited power in global affairs, but they do have the agency to choose their partnerships carefully, and many are understandably wary of being forced to choose definitively between competing powers. What we're witnessing, ultimately, is the return of geography as a central factor in international politics. For a brief historical moment, it seemed as though geography might matter less in an interconnected, globalized world. But as great power competition has intensified, the old realities have reasserted themselves. Proximity matters, Access matters. The ability to project power from forward positions matters. The Caribbean, because of where it sits in relation to the United States, has always mattered to American security. What's changed is that other powers now recognize this and are acting on that recognition. The American response, reopening bases, increasing presence, rebuilding relationships, is an attempt to reclaim an advantage that had been allowed to erode. Whether this approach succeeds will depend not just on military deployments, but on whether the United States can offer the countries of the region a compelling vision of partnership that addresses their needs and respects their sovereignty. That's the broader challenge, and it extends far beyond military bases. But those bases are where the story begins, and they tell us something important about how Washington now views the world and America's place in it.